All right, I'm here with Jennifer Say. She is the former CMO of Levi's and the best-selling author of Levi's Unbuttoned: How the Woke Mob Took My Job But Gave Me My Voice. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Super excited to have you on. I think you and I shared a lot of parallels throughout the pandemic, both being in San Francisco at ground zero for the pandemic. For people that don't know your story, I just want to kind of give a brief synopsis. You were next in line to become the CEO of Levi's. And you had actually brought the company up. I don't want to say from being dead, but there was a huge renaissance and you can say they were dead. Yeah, they were.
Yeah, I mean, it's fairly widely published at this point, and it has come from the current CEO's mouth, in fact, that we were near bankruptcy in the early 2010s. Wow. So you can say that.
Okay, so yeah, they were lifeless. You brought them back, and even up until the day that you were fired, they were congratulating you. They were giving you rewards because your accolades spoke for themselves, and yet you were fired. What happened?
Yeah, I guess technically I wasn't fired, just to clarify, but I was definitely pushed out. I'll tell you the story. I had been at the company 23 years. I started as an entry-level marketing assistant. I worked my way all the way up the ladder, which wasn't totally easy as a woman in corporate America. It wasn't the greatest environment for women in the early 2000s, but I was persistent and delivered results and kept getting promoted and worked mostly in marketing, but did other things too, had run e-commerce for a time. Eventually made my mark as the chief marketing officer, which it was a role I held for 8 years and really was a key member. I won't take full responsibility for driving the resurgence of the brand. And ultimately that led to a very successful initial public offering in 2019. In 2020, I was promoted to brand president. And by all accounts, based on the role and my own performance, was next in line for CEO and would have been the first female CEO and was in fact the first female global brand president. But in early 2020, right from the get-go, in March of 2020, I was outspoken about the closures of San Francisco's public schools and eventually the nation's public schools, the blue states' public schools. And I was just persistent and dogged in speaking out on that and other restrictions to children. I felt like we were using children as human shields. We as adults are supposed to protect our kids. And we were doing exactly the opposite. The most onerous restrictions were placed on kids: closed playgrounds in San Francisco for close to 10 months, masking of 2-year-olds, something not done anywhere else in the world. And they kept telling me I needed to stop talking about this. It was wrong-headed and too controversial. I was called a Trumper and a racist repeatedly for 2 years, and I refused to stop. And I should mention, I was delivering performance this whole time. They insisted it would affect and impact the brand's performance, and it did not. In fact, we recovered very quickly from the depths of COVID. But it was disliked by a minority of employees. And there were, some social media trolls who came for me, and eventually leadership got fed up with that bit of noise, which they tolerate in other areas. And I should also mention, I was always speaking as a mom of 4 children in San Francisco public schools. I never used my title, never used my platform as a business leader. In fact, I actively did not. When I appeared on news programs, I said, they asked me what my title should be, and I would say mom of 4. That's it. Don't use Levi's. And the ironic thing is they would say, oh, you work at Levi's? Like they didn't even know. So all this worry was sort of for nothing.
Yeah.
Anyway, eventually in January of 22, I was told there was not a place for me at the company. They didn't say it, but I was too disobedient and unpredictable because I persisted even when told I needed to desist. And rather than accept severance of $1 million, and their framing of my exit, I quit myself so that I could use my voice and speak freely on the matters because I was concerned about, one, COVID and how we had harmed children and want to be able to talk about that. But I became increasingly concerned as this dragged on about the suppression of speech and open debate and dissent, because I believe if we'd been able to talk about these things publicly, if good doctors weren't silenced and sort of shunted to the side as villains, we would have had a different result and the schools would have opened sooner, just like they did all across Europe.
100%.
Yeah. I wasn't about to silence myself. it just seemed too hypocritical to take the money and shut up after not shutting up for 2 years.
Yeah, I that's amazing though. Still, I mean, hypocritical or not, I mean, just hearing and it would have been easy. I've been saying this a lot, and you are just such an example and a beacon of light of this, is that leadership is doing what is right, not as what is easy. And it would have been easy for you to take the money because honestly, you deserved it. You proved yourself, but you chose not to because you stand for so much more than that. And I know already, like someone of your character, and something I do want to ask you later in the show is like, what are you up to now? Because someone of your character and your magnetism is going to attract more than millions of dollars. It won't even be nothing, you know?
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I'm hoping that you're correct. I think, honestly, there's a crisis of courageous leadership right now in corporate America, and I would argue beyond, in politics and elsewhere. The show of leadership is more important than actual leadership. We liked to say at Levi's that we took the harder right over the easier wrong, and I think I'm proof that that is in fact an act and not the case at all. In fact, it's worth noting that as I was outspoken about opening public schools, all of my peers were sending their kids to in-person private. They were not too afraid to send their children to school. And they were certainly contradicting all that they'd said in the summer of 2020 about fighting for equality. There is nothing that represents greater equality of opportunity for low-income children, for Black children, than high-quality public schools. And when private school children, rich private school children, are in school and their peers in public are not, I mean, it's such a blatant display of inequality. And yet they were too fearful to talk about that. And I can't think of a single business leader, in fact, of a major corporation who pushed back on lockdowns, which harmed employees with layoffs. So, talk to me about courageous leadership when you're actually ready to screw up your courage and do something, because no one did, in my opinion.
Yeah, 100%. But one of my mentors, Tony Blauer, who's a big self-defense expert, he says, fear is contagious, but so is
That's
courage.
right. I agree with that. And that's what pushed me onward. This wasn't my first experience in sort of standing up to lies and stories that are told. I had been an elite gymnast as a child, and it's a very abusive training culture. And I was a successful gymnast. I was the 1986 national champion. But after I left the sport in 1988, for a good 2 decades, I really suffered the repercussions of the abusive culture. And in 2008, I wrote a book, which was a first-person account. It was the first one of the nature of the abuse, the physical, emotional, and yes, even sexual abuse that is now widely known. Well, within the sport and the broader Olympic movement, they did not like this. And I was tarred and feathered. I was determined to be by the community of the Olympic movement and the gymnasts themselves that I trained with, that knew I was telling the truth, a liar and a grifter. This was before Me Too. You didn't believe all women. And for 10 years, I was dragged across the internet as this horrible liar that was just bitter about having been a crappy gymnast. And ultimately, when the story of Larry Nassar broke, and he was the doctor for Team USA for 30 years and sexually assaulted over 500 athletes, everybody sort of pretended that they'd always stood with me. And everybody sort of wanted to be on the right side after having been total cowards, in my opinion. But at the end of the day, most people would rather stand with the crowd than stand up and do the right thing. And when the crowd kind of slowly moves towards what actually is the right thing, they'll go there and pretend they were always there. And so those willing and brave enough to endure the slings and arrows of going first must do it, because they can bring others forward. I don't know why I seem to be that person now 2 times in a row. It's not a particularly fun job. And I'm not particularly brave or courageous. And I certainly am not someone who likes to fight. I'm like a peacemaker, but I won't accept lies as truth. And the fact is the sport is abusive. I wasn't going to say that it wasn't. I suffered because of it, and I wanted to protect other children from having to endure the same. And I was not going to accept, when it came to COVID, that there was no age stratification of risk and that closed public schools weren't going to harm a generation of children. They did, in fact, and we know that now. So I guess that's my line. I won't further a lie.
I love it. Yeah, and I was so excited to hear your history in gymnastics, and I'm like, oh my god, like she's always been a leader and a courage and someone who stands up for truth. And it's so funny that you say it's like I'm not anybody special. I'm not looking to be this courageous person, but at the end of the day, someone has to do it, and who is going to do it? And I
The thing
love it.
is, I find that you usually, it's not like you're like, okay, I'm going to take this on for the world. You just like in your own quiet way and your world. I mean, when I sat down to write my first book, which is called Chalked Up about gymnastics, I didn't even think it would be published. I mean, I was a good gymnast. I was a national team member and a national champion, but I was not a famous gymnast.
You
And
were on the Olympic team, though.
no, not Olympic, but
Okay.
world championship team.
You went to Stanford, though. I mean, and you're
I
playing at a
did.
high level. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of a joke within the gymnastics community that I was like the worst national champion that ever was, which may be true. Who cares? Whatever. It's not the point. It doesn't matter how good you were. And I was plenty good enough to know what the training was like inside the best gyms in the country and inside Team USA. You know, I spent many, many months training with Team USA and enduring the abuse, and many years with my own coaches. I knew what happened. And anyway, I sat down to write the book, and I just sort of did it to make sense of it for myself. Like, I didn't think it would get published. Like, it wasn't this bold statement to say, I am going to save these children. But I did get it published. And, you know, at first I really went into a self-protection mode because the onslaught was intense, and it was the early days of social media. So I didn't really know what that was going to be like. I didn't know what I know now, that you just should not read the comments, you know? And it really threw me for a loop. But the more they fought me and said I was lying, the more it strengthened my resolve. And then I did sort of commit to fighting. You know, I didn't back down at that point because I was not going to be called a liar. I knew what I was saying was true. It wasn't my truth. It was the truth. It was the truth. I really hate the phrase my truth. This was not my truth. There was, 25% of the coaches on the coaching staff at my gym were known pedophiles. That's the truth. That's not my truth.
Jen, this is still going on though in gymnastics today, in women's gymnastics, isn't it still? I mean, or do you think it's lightened up a little bit?
No, I think it still is. I think culture change is hard. I think this is what the culture has been like for 50 years since the sport sort of started to take off here in the United States. It was this way long before the Carolis ever got to America. Some people sort of attribute it to them and bringing the culture, the Romanian coaching culture here. I am here to tell you, I was doing the sport before they got here. It was really bad then too. But there have been some significant changes. You know, the story of Larry Nassar breaking and him going to prison for life, and the complicitness of the leaders at USA Gymnastics and other coaches exposed a lot. We've seen the passage of the Safe Sport Act, which is not as well funded as it could be, which would make a bigger difference. But I think the real difference is athletes have recognized the culture as incredibly problematic, both through my outspokenness as well as Olympic champion Dominique Moceanu. A film that I produced called Athlete A really galvanized athletes around the world to say no more. This is the insidious part, is when you're in that environment, you don't realize it's abusive. You think you're just too weak to handle it.
Yeah.
And so I think what Athlete A did, and I say this having got hundreds of emails from young women, is it explained to them why they felt beaten down and abused and disoriented and had PTSD and all of these things from, after leaving the sport. They realized that even if they were not sexually abused, they were emotionally and physically abused. And when I say that, I mean starvation level diets, bullied, in some cases slapped and hit, forced to train on serious injuries. Like, this is the coaching culture. This is what it is. But we were trained to believe that that was normal, tough coaching. And if we were having a tough time with it, that was on us. We were the weak ones, and we were disposable, and they would just move on from us if we couldn't hack it. And so I think the athletes have come to realize that that's bullshit, frankly, and that they were abused emotionally and physically, and that's why they suffer. And they've stood up and they've said no more, and they've demanded change. And ultimately, I think most change comes at the grassroots level. I'll really quickly wrap this up. I was part of a group of young women who met with Dianne Feinstein. That it was a meeting that led to the passage of the Safe Sport Act. And she said, this is when she was still a little more together. She said to us at the time, I will help get a law passed. I can't change the culture. Culture change is hard. And her point was both things have to happen. If we pass a law that, for instance, makes everybody that works with young children in sport a mandatory reporter, which they were not before, then they can be held liable if they don't report abuse that they know about. The minute somebody is held liable, that sends a message to everybody else that they need to uphold the law. But her point, I think, is a really valid one, which is culture change takes a long time. The sport has functioned this way forever. And when the athletes and the parents demand change is when it will happen. So I think it's starting to happen, but it's not done.
Yeah. Speaking of culture change, just thinking, I think towards the end of the book, you even bring up a great example, and it blew my. I never thought about this, but you were talking about the Girls Gone Wild director, right? And it was. I remember even as a kid, I remember just like the infomercials on regular. This was on TV. This was on the internet, regular TV, and saying like, oh, order whatever, dial 1-800 and order Girls Gone Wild, and that was socially acceptable. Like it was okay. And I mean,
on family shows, it was on that show with like Paris Hilton and what's her name, Nicole Richie. I know.
Yeah.
I kind of had an aha moment when I thought of that and how grotesque it was, right? It was just demeaning to women. It was objectifying. It was just gross. And that was just what they showed on the family programming.
Yeah.
What you didn't know about what was happening behind the scenes, which was full on sexual assault and rape from the show's producers, of very young women, underage women. And that was completely normalized in the culture of the mid-90s. Yeah. And I think it's good to, one, it's astonishing that could have ever been normalized, but that is a testament to how far the culture has come, that would be no longer acceptable. But I think it just demonstrates how you can kind of get in this mindset where absolutely horrific, grotesque things are normalized.
And we're seeing that right now too. So that's why, I mean, and we're seeing that just with the whole gender stuff, and we're seeing a lot of that. And so I love that example because it brings home to a lot of the things that are going on right now. It's so important.
He was like I can't remember the guy's name who was the CEO. He was like a celeb.
Yeah.
I mean, he was accepted into polite society. Meanwhile, he was running basically a pornography ring that sexually assaulted underage women. And he's invited to, Kardashian weddings and stuff like that. It's kind of mind-blowing how far we've come from that. And I think is a testament to this is what I struggle with, right? It's a testament to the value of something like the Me Too movement, that is not acceptable anymore. I believe we do need to listen to women. And I think there's so many of these things that are happening in the world now, and we can talk about them that have driven really positive change. I write about in my book, in the second book, Levi's Unbuttoned, the workplace for women is much better now than when I started out. That's important to recognize. I couldn't go to a sales meeting without having to worry about drunken sales guys coming on to me as a 20-something. That was crappy. That would be unacceptable at Levi's now, and dare I say any other company. I mean, I'm sure it still happens, but it's pretty unacceptable. That's a testament to how far we come. I think it's important that we recognize progress. And then there's a point where I think it's all gone a little bit crazy and haywire and is sometimes taken too far.
Yeah. I wanted to just kind of backtrack really quick because I thought it was so fascinating. You attacked this whole pandemic from the children perspective, which I thought that was genius. Like that's the best way and the safest way to attack it. I can tell you, I was on social media. I'm a very natural, health-oriented person. I didn't attack it from that direction. I was censored. I was banned. It was all kinds of names. And looking back, I probably should have taken a different approach now. But
there was no approach that would keep you safe, Joel. Yeah. Honestly, I mean, I that was sort of calculated for me. I thought this is the bridge builder. Kids, everybody cares about children. Yeah, but I still lost my job. And I was probably called all the names you were. You couldn't push back on any of it if you didn't if you weren't in whole hog and basically not just doing what you were supposed to, but doing it enthusiastically and loving it and staying home and getting 12 vaccines, like all of it, then you were an evil, horrible apostate.
Yeah, and it blows my mind too because I'll try to use the V word as little as I can because I'll just call it a product because I know how censorship runs. But you actually got the product, and you were just speaking. What I love is, and I try to do the same thing at one point, even with my family members and people that disagree with me, is just look at the data. Let's not get emotional about this. You're a very logical person. You say you are. Here's the data. Like no one's in danger. So I'm curious for your perspective, like why couldn't people see through the clouds? You people you're working around they're intelligent people. These people aren't idiots. And even like you had conversation with workers that were, questioning, Jen, why are you posting these things? And you're like, excuse me, Miss So-and-so, your kid is going to private school. My kid is going to a public school and she can't. So what were they, I mean, like, what were they saying to you? Like, how could they not see the hypocrisy? Or even look at the data. I mean, what do you think was going on?
Well, nobody was looking at data. So people were terrified, whether they were purposefully misled or not by leaders, I will leave to somebody else. I think in some cases purposely misled, and I think in some cases others just furthered the message. I think, between government and the press, there was a complete failure to be open and transparent with people. Why is the $1 million question. You had to look really long and hard to find the real facts, but they were there. And most people aren't going to do that. They're not going to dig around. And, there was a running death ticker on CNN 24 hours a day. That's terrifying to people. I mean, if we had that going now, which we don't, for every other way that people die in the world, no one would ever leave their home, which maybe is what they want and they should re-implement it. I don't know. But there was literally a running death ticker. You opened the New York Times and that's what you saw. You watched CNN, that was the Chiron. Schools were
I mentioned this, I remember in a speech that I gave, I said, if we did this for car accidents, you would never, if we showed a death ticker of how many people are dying right now from car accidents, we would never get in a car or even leave our house. I mean, it's because more people are dying from that.
So why don't they want to do that? Is a good question. But I think it started out in every state, every single state across the country, pretty much, with maybe one or two exceptions. Very quickly, and I think it's wrong for so many reasons. One, the data was misrepresented, which is incredibly misguided and dishonest and a horrible thing for leadership to do. But the second piece of it is, and I think this is what we should ask ourselves, in my mind, it was wrong regardless. It was an extreme violation of our civil rights. People couldn't congregate. People were, you weren't allowed to have people in your homes. They were policing, your own private home life. People couldn't go to work. People couldn't gather outside. People couldn't do all sorts of things.
Unless you're Gavin Newsom going to the French Laundry or Maryland.
That's right. And that's the part.
Taking your mask off and partying to Tony.
And the fact that no one cared about that hypocrisy, and because it wasn't just Gavin, it was leaders from across the country.
100%.
The mayor of Denver, which is where I live now, the same thing. I used to keep a running list of them. It goes on and on. And the LA mayor did the same thing. London Breed did the same thing in San Francisco. I don't understand why people didn't see that hypocrisy and say, oh, they're not actually scared. They're lying to us. They didn't. And I think it was cult-like, and it became the position of the Democratic Party that you had to adopt the view that COVID was, an equal opportunity disease. It wasn't, was more deadly than it was. And that if you wanted to be a good person, you had to stay home forever until they told you it was okay to come out. That was the view that good people had. Well, I disagree. I think disallowing people to work, I think disallowing children to go to school, disallowing people to worship, I think it's evil, frankly, and it's a violation of our civil rights. And you know, but you were in San Francisco. It was so intense. I mean, my husband and I felt like the only ones in the city that were seeing things clearly,
Same here.
And I think I think of it this way. I think there's a percentage of people that were deeply, deeply terrified. Probably many at first, but eventually not a huge percentage. I think there were a large percentage, say 50%, 60%, that just go along. They're like, oh, what's the harm? These are the rules. They don't want to stand apart. They get to feel very virtuous if they follow the rules. And then there were a very, very small percentage willing to question and challenge and deal with everything that entailed, which was pretty awful, by the way, to challenge. I mean, clearly I had a successful career and I was ousted from my job and I'm now considered pretty unemployable. So, I'm not saying it's not hard, but I think if those in the middle that saw the madness and weren't willing to say anything had stood with us, we would have been the majority. And those are the people I would challenge to speak up.
That's so interesting. I love that. There's this old quote I remember, and it's I think from some Greek philosopher, and he says, like, 10 men go to war. 10 men go to war. 8 of them are just merely targets. One of them is like courageous or something, and then it said, but only one is a true warrior. And it just reminds me of, like,
I think that's right.
You're right.
That's the divide. Most people just don't want to risk it, and I get it.
Yeah,
it is a risk. I'm not going to lie. It really is. But to me, the alternative is worse, which is accepting that the lies are true, accepting censorship, accepting that government issued talking points are journalism, accepting that press releases from big pharma are facts. That's not true. I just accepting the harm to children. I won't accept that. Ooh.
Yeah. I have 2 kids as well, 9 and 5. And I agree with you 100%. I saw my kid was in kindergarten at the time, and I saw the effects of that. And then moving forward, we've gone to homeschooling, so it's a little bit different.
Oh, interesting.
But, I agree with you so much. And I know a lot of friends still in California that are dealing with the ramifications, and they're teachers and they run martial arts schools, and they're seeing this disconnect of what's happened to the kids coming back into their schools. They're like, what's wrong? Not what's wrong with you, but just like, it's just they're trying to figure out how to teach to these people and talk to them. It's like there's been such a gap from the 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, they've lost 2 years of normal emotional and psychosocial development. There's violence in the schools. There's very high rates of absenteeism. Young children didn't learn to connect and engage emotionally. They didn't learn how to move from one activity to the next, which is really what the early days of school are about, right? Sit in your chair, listen to the teacher, take instructions, interact with your peers. They didn't learn any of that, in addition to not learning how to read and do basic math. And so, these kids are emotionally very behind and not able to integrate back into the classroom in the ways that they need to.
Yeah.
And there's no plan to fill that gap.
No, there's not. I wanted to talk to you about, you mentioned standing up for your truth, and one of my mentors, Dave Meltzer, says nothing vibrates faster than the truth. This experience, I lost my job in October 2021, same thing, because I refused to not align with my truth. And it has been such an experiment in surrender and me just learning through this process. But but something that struck me, I thought it was interesting, and I think you mentioned this, is that you said you didn't discover this truth until you were 51 years old. Like you found your truth, kind of thing. Like looking back now in your life, do you wish you had done anything? Would you have done anything different to find your quote unquote? Because I feel almost the same way, Jen. I got to be honest. Like I was just 2 years ago. I'm like, man, this was like I didn't ask for this either. I didn't ask to be a hero or stand up for anything. It just kind of happened to me, and it made me ask a lot of questions about my own life and like, what do I stand for? What is my truth? What am I on this earth? What is my purpose for? And so I'm curious for you, is there anything looking back now that you would wish you would have asked yourself or done differently, maybe to align with your truth sooner?
I'm not sure that's a worthwhile exercise. Your life takes the path that it does, and, we're confronted with things when we are. And, it's not to say that I hadn't been bold and spoken the truth before, but this was on such a bigger stage and at a larger scale, given the global reach of COVID versus, speaking out to the gymnastics community and the Olympic movement. I don't know that there was a different way to kind of confront that moment that is like, okay, are you going to stand up or are you not? And people ask me all the time now, was it worth it? Why was this the hill you were willing to die on? And all I can say back is, why weren't you? Do you even have a hill? I mean, honestly, if you're not willing to stand up for freedom of speech and for children who are being harmed, then you have no principles at all. But I think what I learned is, I am about principles, not party. And most people are about party affiliation, group affiliation. They don't realize it, but they are. Yeah. And that's a pretty disheartening realization. But I don't think there's anything unique about this moment when it comes to realizing that. I think that's just true across decades and across geographies. Most people will stand with the group and not stand up and do what's right and endure the slings and arrows from that. That's just human nature.
So, yeah, I mean, just thinking about it, is there anything you'd recommend to other people? I feel like there's probably a lot of people that are in search of their own truth, but is there anything that you would say? I mean, you mentioned some really good things, though, just principles. And I think, again, going back to courage, I think just looking at this is the easiest path. Will I take this or will I do the hard things?
Well, is it easy long term? What does it result in? Will you be able to look yourself in the mirror? If we play this out and no one stands up, what happens? If I hadn't stood up in the world of gymnastics, would the next person have written the book that she wrote? Would the next athlete who spoke up have spoken up? Would we have a situation now where there is an athlete movement to create change in the sport and a law that actually requires it? What would have happened if I hadn't? Would the abuse have gone on even longer than it has and continues to some extent? And to me, the alternative is just unacceptable, to allow abuse to continue, to allow the schools to stay closed longer, and to allow lies to actually be represented as truth in the world. What I tell people is, you don't have to blow your whole life up and lose your job. Just challenge the lies in small ways in your everyday life. Whatever it is, just small ways in your everyday community and your everyday life. I'm struck by, I read a piece recently by journalist David Zweig, who wrote about a school in New York, not New York City, but I think in upstate New York, that still has very aggressive policies regarding COVID, masking for children outside, a silent lunch. They can't speak at lunch. They can't talk to each other because this is now in April 2023. Wow. And the most striking part of the piece is not that they still have this, which is striking, but that the parents agree to it. This is a private school. You could leave. And he interviewed parents in the piece and they say, well, we just don't want to rock the boat.
Wow.
And if you won't rock the boat to stand up for your kids, then I'm sorry. I don't know. I have no respect for you as a person. That's pathetic.
Wow.
So imagine that when I say in your world, imagine if those parents just came together at the school. They're paying money. This is not a public school to say, take the masks off our kids. There's no masks anywhere else in all of New York State. This is ridiculous. Let them talk at lunch. The interaction is key to their emotional development. This is a miserable experience. It's a miserable prison-like experience. Do it now or we're all leaving. Why can't you do that? Not one would do it. Not one family pushed back.
It's so true. In California, I can just say, just from an officer's standpoint, the departments that had a majority of people that were willing to stand up and say, we're not going to do this. You can't mandate this. They always back down. The departments always back down. They said, we'll make you test and do other things. And I know for a fact, Los Angeles, just as liberal as San Francisco, backed down. And the reason is they backed down is because they had 2,000 officers, which was 20% of their department, that said, we're not taking this. We only had about 100 in San Francisco that quickly dwindled to maybe 50. So they were willing to have that opportunity cost of losing those 50. And I'm sure they got federal kickbacks. I have no idea. It doesn't even matter to me. But you're right. When people stood up, change happen, and those that
Well,
didn't,
I
we
think
saw what
the
happened.
the playgrounds in San Francisco is a good example. I mean, they were closed an excessively long time, I think about 9 months. But when parents finally said they had enough, and the outcry on social media and in real life was just too great, the city relented. Now, they did it under the guise of it's safer now, we can do it, we know outdoors is fine. But that's a lie. They did it because the parents said, enough already. There's no place else in the country where this is the case. We don't have yards. We don't have a place for our kids to play. Enough. And that made a difference. And for me, that was encouraging. That made me believe that we could make a difference. But most were still too afraid to join us on the schools fight. So we didn't get to that level of critical mass, unfortunately, until the
Yeah.
recall election when the school board members were recalled.
Yep. That was huge. What I'm curious, you talk about this in the book, and I've struggled with this too. People have asked me on social media, and you talk about this woke mob, this woke capitalism. What does it mean to be woke, in your opinion?
I mean, my definition is really that it's become this ideology that defines the entire world and all the world's problems we face through the lens of oppressor versus oppressed. And that's just not a useful binary all the time. The fact is, even the closed schools by the woke got defined that way. But at the end of the day, it wasn't about oppressor versus oppressed. It was about the fact that our kids have a constitutional right to an equal education. That's what it was about. It was just about that. But it was turned into, you're a racist if you want the schools to open. It will harm the most vulnerable among us, Black children, when in fact the reverse was true. Low income Black children, et cetera, who are more likely to be in public schools, were the most harmed by these policies. But we defined through the world through the lens of oppressor and oppressed, rather than looking at this as what it really was. I could go down the list of all of the issues that end up getting defined that way, right? We view climate through a lens of racism now, which is kind of crazy. I think the body positivity movement is defined through that lens at this point, oppressor and oppressed, the oppressed in that instance being the overweight or obese. I don't know what the acceptable term is anymore. And so if we're viewing it as they are oppressed, then the only way to sort of attack it, if you will, is to, it's the wrong answer. The right answer is we need folks to get healthy. The real issue here is we don't move enough and we don't eat right. That's the issue. This is not an issue of oppressor versus oppressed. Some issues are, but when you see the entire world through that lens, I think that is wokeism, and it is seeing, racism where it isn't the driver of the challenge. And then you can't get to the right answer. You can't get to the right solution for a particular problem if you're not framing it in the right way, in my opinion. But that sort of wokeism view sees oppression everywhere in every problem. And to my mind, that is not an effective binary with which to view the world's problems.
To me, it seems too like we'll never, like you said, solve a problem, because you can never disagree or have, I know Joe Rogan mentioned this idea of like honest conflict has much more social value than dishonest harmony. But wokeism creates this, it's not okay to say that, so then we just won't say it. And like you said, we just kind of go along with the minority.
Well, I mean, that is one of the sort of tenets of wokeism, right? Is that because we view every challenge through that lens of oppressor and oppressed, we cannot further harm the oppressed with language, with dialogue on a particular subject. They need to be privileged in every way because they're already so oppressed. So censorship becomes necessary, right?
Yes.
And who the oppressed is different in every dynamic, because in some dynamics it's women, but now we're seeing with the issue of gender ideology and trans female athletes in sports, women are it's the trans athletes that are more oppressed that need to be prioritized. Right. And suddenly we don't care about the fact that this creates an unequal playing field for women in sports. And so it's this moving target that people can't get their, wrap their heads around anyway, because it's always this sort of competitive hierarchy for who is the victim. But the censorship it's an outcropping of it, right? Because of the way we prioritize certain groups, and that disallows certain conversations. It was violence to talk about the fact that schools should open. It was misogyny and it was racism to talk about it. And
Or you were somehow a MAGA Trump lover just because you agreed to that,
Well, they'll throw any name at the book to throw any name in the book at you to try to keep you silent. And then when they realize they can't keep you silent, it definitely has the effect of self-censorship for others, because nobody wants to go through that. And truth doesn't matter. The odd ad hominem attacks, they don't have to be true. They're equally effective in keeping others silent. Because who wants to be called those things? I mean, I was none of those things. I am none of those things.
Yeah.
And at first I tried to defend myself against them, but I realized you can't really do that. You just have to sort of let it roll off your back, because there's no convincing someone that wants to call you a QAnon, Trump, MAGA supporter. You don't have to ever have voted for Trump. You don't have to even know what QAnon is. You don't have to. Yeah. It doesn't matter, though. The truth doesn't matter. It's really an act of silencing.
Yeah. And the only solution I can see, and I'm curious, and that's why I think
is to laugh at it and keep talking. That's the only solution.
Yeah, but I think it's the only solution, and you talk about this in the book, is leadership. And that's why I think you are such a powerful force moving forward. I'm just really excited to see what you're going to create and do, because leadership is always the problem and leadership is always the solution. And you gave great examples of Dave Chappelle being ousted on Netflix and his show, and Joe Rogan from Spotify. They tried to belittle him and use all kinds of attacks. But when Spotify and Netflix CEOs stood up to the vocal but minority mob, when they stood up and said, "That's great, thanks for your concern, but we're still moving forward," it went away.
It totally went away. That's what's so sort of insane about this is, I cite the example of Netflix. A very vocal punitive minority wanted the show taken off the platform, and the CEO said, no, a lot of people want to watch this. We're going to run a lot of kinds of content. If you don't like it, you can leave. As far as I know, no one left and everything went back to normal. It doesn't take that much, but I think, to put it in the context of business, my experience after 30 years in business is that most leaders are cowards, and they've gotten to the top by sort of threading the needle and looking to their right and left and kind of doing what was acceptable and having a degree of mastery over the content of the job. I kept waiting as I moved up the ladder to get in the room where I experienced courageous leadership. I thought, in the next level, I'll see it. And no, never. I was sort of stunned. It's just not there. And I think it's gotten worse over the years, frankly, because they're more fearful of that punitive minority. They are fearful of those young employees, which to me is just pathetic. Why are you afraid? Just stand up. You're leading a business here. Make it about leading a business with excellence. But they get a lot of kudos and props for pretending to be social justice warriors. And they like that. These are folks with large egos. Let's not mince words. And they don't get a lot of props for being super rich anymore. But make no mistake, that's their primary goal. They like that. That used to be something they got a lot of, applause for and respect for. But in today's world, you have to disavow your privilege. So they have to kind of create a way or a dynamic to keep collecting all that money that they want while getting the kudos in another way. And they do that by pretending to be these social justice warriors, CEOs. It also has the secondary benefit of shielding them from scrutiny from the press, because the press just eats it up and they write these glowing profiles and they put them on the cover of Forbes. And it's all just bullshit,
100%. Okay, Jennifer, what's next for you? What exciting projects do you have going forward? I really just think this, you could put a clinic on for leadership of the next generation, and people should be paying you lots of money to be learning how to be this courageous leader. And I think that is the CEOs that we see in the next generation, like this is who we need to be learning from. But I'm just curious, what's
Yeah,
next?
I think they need that. They need the words. They don't even, I say it, sorry, I'll tell you, they don't even say what they think. They don't write their own words. They don't write their own speeches. They don't, they've got HR on the one hand and Corpcom on the other telling them what they need to do. And they just listen and do that rather than kind of make up their own mind on something. So I agree with you that if there were someone they could take advice from that just said, do it this way, say this, try this, and see what happens. Because I firmly believe in my company, if the CEO had stood up in front of the company and said, look, I know some of you are unhappy with the things Jen is saying. She has a right to say them, just like you do. You can go out and vote for who you want, and you can be activist in any way that you want. Here, we're going to get back to work. So I don't want to talk about it anymore. You do you, she'll do her. Let's focus on the business. That's all it would have taken. But he
Jen,
didn't.
can I interrupt? Just the hypocrisy too of it, and I didn't even think about this till really listening to your book and digesting some of the things you said, but they were Levi's was outwardly supporting anti-Trump sentiment and actually donating money, I think, against the NRA, if I remember what you mentioned. So it's like when it was okay to pick a political side, they did, and it wasn't considered wrong as long as everybody was going with it.
They said it wasn't politics, that wasn't political. It was just, it was a sleight of hand. Of course, It's political.
Sure. Opening schools, though, to me is not political. I mean, I understand that. I understand the nuances, but it's just hypocrisy. Anyway,
it is. It's just hypocrisy. That's what it comes down to. And you have large companies largely aligning themselves with the policies of the Democratic Party. And when you have the press and corporate America and government aligned, there's a word for that. It's called fascism, and it's what the left accuses the right of, but I see it largely practiced on the left at this point. And I come from the left, and I find it really alarming and very scary. But that's literally the definition of fascism, right?
Yeah.
They would say it wasn't political. They say I was putting employees' lives at risk, which is absurd on its face. We were working virtually. As you say, I adhered to every rule and policy. I wore a mask at work. I got vaccinated despite not wanting to be. I never spoke out against the policies of the company. I spoke on behalf of children. Anyway, what I'm doing, I'm in the process of making a documentary film on the harms to children from school closures. It's called Generation COVID. We're almost done shooting, and we start editing any minute, and that's very exciting. So if you have any listeners that want to invest, I'm here. We've been raising money, and that's going pretty well so far. And I want to go back to work. That's what I want to do. I love the work that I did, and I want to be able to do it in an environment that lets employees be human beings and have opinions, and is interested in just focusing on the work, and not all this other stuff. People get to be people outside of work. They get to say what they think. And in the workplace, we should focus on delivering a great product and marketing it in a way that is compelling and inspiring. And that's it. Create a really actually inclusive workplace where people with different views can actually come and get along. That's what I want. I want to go back to work. So.
Okay, so what company are you starting? Is this going to be the new clothing company that is going to espouse all these virtues?
Yeah, I have no plans to start one. I am consulting with quite a few companies right now and enjoying that. But I'm interested in a full-time job. I'm not so old I want to retire. I'm ready to keep going. But I got a lot of projects going. So another documentary I'm contemplating. Like I said, I'm doing consulting. I want to help bring the workplace back to normie capitalism is what I call it in the book.
Yeah.
Which again doesn't mean that's hard here. Like, I'm not a hard writer, right? Like, I appreciate that the workplace is more inclusive now for women and for people of color. I think that there's been tremendous progress there. I'm not saying it was okay before. I don't want to go back to 1995. I don't want that, but it's just all gone so far. We're not even focused on the business and the consumer anymore. The time I spent in the last 3 to 4 years at the company focused on non-business related things. It was taking over and it was eclipsing our focus from the task at hand. And we see it now over and over again in business. And it's got to crash. Like it can't work when your focus is that far afield, from the task at hand.
Yeah. I want to wrap things up, but before I do it, I have some final round questions that I like to ask all guests if we still have some time. But anything I didn't ask you before we go to that final round questions?
No, I think you did good.
Awesome. I know this is gonna be an easy one for you. For some guests, I feel like I already know the answer, but for some guests, this doesn't come out till like right around now. But I'm just curious, any was there a choice or choices that you made that you think made you who you are today?
Oh gosh. I mean, obviously you're the sum of all of the things you've done in your life. And certainly there are things that were very difficult that I wouldn't want to revisit, breaking my femur in 1985 and coming back 9 months later to win the national championship was triumphant, but probably harmful in a lot of ways, but I wouldn't change it. I will say, I think my choice of second husband has really helped shape me, and knowing during everything that happened during COVID that we could look each other in the eye and say, we're not crazy. We see it. We see what's going on. I mean, I can't imagine if we hadn't supported each other through it.
Yeah, that's so huge. Same with my wife. I mean, we talked about it. She's like, if we didn't see eye to eye in a lot of these issues during the pandemic, we probably would have got divorced. I'm like, yeah, I didn't really think about that, but you're right. I mean,
for sure.
Yeah.
I definitely know couples that struggled.
Yeah. I'm curious, you're such a force in just the business world and even the health world, I think, because by taking your stances, who inspires you or anybody that you follow?
Oh gosh. My answer would be so different now than it was years ago. I'm almost inspired by zero business leaders. I'm very inspired by the doctors who continued to speak out during COVID. People like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya and Dr. Scott Atlas, they risked so much in their careers, with their careers and reputations, and they continued and persisted. I mean, they are just dogged. They keep going because they want to do the right thing, and they are doing the right thing. And it's cost them. It's very brave. Yeah. People like Aaron Cariotti. I mean, the doctors, people have lost their licenses. They've been threatened with, their tenure is threatened. Their reputations have been torn to shreds. And yet they persist because they want to do the right thing. Those people really inspire me.
Yeah, very cool. I agree. I'm a big reader. Any books? There's like a top 1 to 3 books that shaped your life or just changed you, and you say, hey, if somebody asks you that, you say, go out and read these books.
Well, my favorite book, I always tell people, is I like fiction, is Revolutionary Road. It's a book by Richard Yates. It was the first book he wrote, and he sort of sadly and tragically only became known after he died. But as I think about it in context, it is a reminder not to lose touch with who you are and what you want in your life. It's a very tragic and very sad book, but I think it is illustrative of two young people who had huge hopes and dreams for themselves and kind of gave up and disconnected from themselves. And it ends tragically.
Amazing. Last 2 questions, we'll wrap it up. Are there any rituals or practices that you do like on a regular basis? I know some people do gratitude journaling and saunas and cold plunges. What do you do?
My main thing is I walk a lot. To me, that's almost, meditative. I try to get out twice a day at least. I try to get my, whatever it is, 15,000 steps at least in a day. I've been doing that for probably 6 or 7 years. And when I go out, my head is full of all kinds of stressful things. And, by the end of an hour, 90 minutes, my head is clear and I've enjoyed the sunshine and I feel much better. So for me, it's very simple. All it takes is a pair of sneakers.
So, walking is so anything. Underrated. Yeah,
I agree. And, it's amazing because I don't know. I made a decision about 6 or 7 years ago that I wasn't going to push myself like crazy in my workouts because every time I was going to be consistent over intense. Yeah. And that way I would continue, which is exactly what I've done. Is I've continued, and it actually does work for health. Like my resting heart rate is lower, than it was in my 30s. I weigh less than I did. My mindset is better. And it's just walking. I mean, that's almost all I do. I do some other stuff. I have a bike at home, but mostly I walk.
Consistency is the key, and you found something that you like too. So that's the key. And
I think if
it's
you
about
make
that.
yourself miserable when you work out because it's too hard, you won't want to continue. Or at least that's true for me.
Yeah,
So I try not to make myself miserable when I work out.
that's always a good thing.
Yeah.
Jennifer, last but not least, where can people connect with you, find you, learn more about what you're up to, and get your book?
I think the two main things at Twitter, Jennifer Say, just my name, that's SEY. Substack, Jennifer Say. I write about all kinds of stuff, woke capitalism, etc. Would love it if people check that out. And then the book, best place is Amazon, and you can get it in hardcover, audio, or ebook.
Yeah, amazing. Jennifer Say, thanks for being on the show. Appreciate you.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for all you're doing as well.